For this week's topic, we're going to look at answering this question: what is archaeology? So we're going to provide a definition of what archaeology is, but then also kind of critique and examine that definition by looking at different kinds of archaeology. This will allow us to address some of our major themes of what archaeology is and what archaeology is not. We'll also begin by looking at archaeology as part of anthropology, because in not all places is archaeology taught as part of anthropology departments. The other course themes that are driving our class this term we'll look at a little bit later. So interpreting the past, analyzing material culture, and archaeology today will be woven throughout the rest of the term. So before we define archaeology, let's define anthropology. Anthropology is simply the study of humans, but it's not that simple, is it? Because it's the study of humans, that means it needs to be very broad in scope, encompassing all places, all peoples, all time period. It must be global and comprehensive. Fundamental to our approach to this term will be applying the anthropological perspective. So we have to begin with what I'm hoping for many of you is a review of the anthropological perspective. So archaeology is only one of the subfields of anthropology proper. The other subfields are biological anthropology, cultural anthropology, linguistic anthropology, and applied anthropology. But let's start with the anthropological perspective. The anthropological perspective is, as stated here, what links the four subfields and distinguishes anthropologists from other scientists, be they social scientists, natural scientists, or physical scientists. Basically, all of the other kinds of academics, well, even if they don't even think of themselves as scientists, who study humans and people. So the anthropological perspective has four major components, and we're going to look at each of these briefly in turn. First, we have cultural relativism. While I appreciate this definition by Greenwood and Stinney in their 1977 textbook, the most simplest way to understand cultural relativism is the way that anthropologists attempt to study and understand other cultures. And when we do so, we do try to avoid as much as possible our own biases, and we study cultural practices and beliefs and worldviews without judging them on the basis of our own culture. So what this means then is we are trying to understand that other culture in its own terms. We're trying to understand it in a way that's sympathetic. And by sympathetic, what that means is that we understand that for other people, their beliefs represent a coherent and meaningful design for living, right? Different from our own, or they may be different from our own. So we attempt to understand how and why they are different from our own. If we are unable to view another society's customs and ideas within the context of their own problems and opportunities, if we do not approach another cultural's beliefs sympathetically, then we are being ethnocentric. We are judging another society's customs and ideas in the context of our own cultures. And we refer to this as being very reductionist, right? It kind of boils down the variety that exists in human cultures, behaviors, and experiences to an understanding that there's only one correct way of being or doing things. And as anthropologists, we don't do this. We attempt to avoid judging other societies and instead seek to understand. One of the questions I won't answer here today, but something we need to consider, is whether or not it is even possible to avoid an ethnocentric bias in our research and in our studies. The next part of the anthropological perspective, which we'll look at length in this term when we talk about archaeological fieldwork and excavation, is participant observation. And participant observation means that we study other cultures, we gain insights into other cultures by participating in those other cultural activities. Right? So if I want to learn about cheese making, for example, as practiced by another culture, I can't simply just read up about what people from that culture say they do when they make cheese, but rather I'm going to go and meet with cheesemakers, participate with them as they make cheese, but recognize that I am observing and participating as an outsider. Now, contemporary archaeology and anthropology kind of challenges this idea of what it means to be an outsider, but it's important to note that generally speaking, we do see ourselves as such. Another important distinction from other social scientists is that we don't have research subjects. Instead, we refer to the people who participate in our studies, in our research, by a number of different terms, as informants, consultants, experts, respondents, teachers, or even in some cases, colleagues and friends. We also have holism. This is often defined simply as an understanding of culture and of human societies as the sum of its parts. It's the idea that if we want to understand one aspect of human behavior, if we want to understand human behavior in general, we can't understand just one aspect. We have to understand the correlation and interrelationship between all of our biological and cultural processes, plus how we interact with our environments. So what this means is that we see human beings and our societies as open systems, right? We're subject to influence and can change. Then we have cross-cultural comparison, or ethnology. The idea that before we make any generalizations about human nature, human society, or human history, and that's important, this last point for our course, is that we're going to consider a wide range of human societies, looking at not just similarities, not just differences, but both. Okay, so let's spend the rest of this topic looking at what archaeology is. It turns out it's not so easy to find. While textbooks typically start here with this idea of the study of the past material culture, we can challenge both the idea of, well, what does it mean to study the past? How old does something have to be for it to be part of the past? How long ago does it have to be? And also, what do we mean by material culture? So throughout the term, I'd like us to start with this definition, but then interrogate it and challenge it and critique it. I've mentioned off the start that in our discipline, in our program here in this course, we're coming from an anthropological, archaeological perspective. So we are teaching archaeology as part of anthropology, but in other countries, as I discussed below, archaeology is a separate department. It's not taught as part of anthropology, and I describe some of the reasons for this. It largely relates to anthropology and archaeology as being colonial disciplines. There are many different subfields within archaeology, many different kinds of ways of doing archaeology, of studying archaeology, and you can see that they vary from everything from different kinds of raw materials to time periods to regions that archaeologists specialize in. I've given you in this PowerPoint a little bit of an explanation of my research interests, just to kind of illustrate that archaeologists don't have to necessarily specialize in just one particular place or time period or material, that over the course of our career trajectories, our interests can and do change. And then I also talk a little bit about some of the opportunities I've had to have students join me in the field and to help me conduct research. Broadly, however, we can talk about four major types of archaeology: academic archaeology, archaeology in industry or cultural resource management archaeology, indigenous archaeologies, and amateur archaeologies. We'll begin by looking at archaeology in industry or cultural resource management, or CRM. This is one of the largest employers of archaeologists in North America, and Canada has some of the strongest CRM laws in the world. Before any development takes place, government clearance is required. There's a number of different phases, and I talk about these below, that are involved in CRM archaeology. It comes with it a number of good things. CRM is responsible for finding and recording a significant portion of sites in most provinces, and this is because of the difference in scope in the areas and the kinds of questions that academic archaeologists ask versus just the necessity of doing archaeological impact assessments in CRM. It's helped cities and municipalities develop plans for archaeological resources using technologies like GIS, or Global Information Systems. And many First Nations and Inuit communities, or we may broadly say Indigenous communities, have benefited from CRM archaeology because oral history and traditional land use mapping is often required as part of those impact assessments. There are some negatives, and this is what I'll do throughout the term, is not just highlight the good, but also the bads of our discipline, areas where I think we can have change. That for a significant period of time, CRM archaeologists were seen as lacking credibility, that because they were being paid for their labor, because they were working for industry, that somehow they were less ethical or less credible than academic archaeologists. This has changed significantly. However, as employers go, it is subject, of course, to boom and bust cycles of the economy. When oil and gas, for example, is doing well in Alberta, there tends to be a lot of jobs because there's a lot of projects on the go. But when the economy has slowed down, particularly in the development fields, then we see far less archaeology positions. There's also some issues around younger archaeologists being hired into these positions, and also some of the dangerous working conditions that are associated with it. With Indigenous archaeology, and this should more properly probably be called Indigenous archaeologies, we see this as one way that Indigenous communities in Canada can be, and also in other countries, can be part of archaeology. And this can take a number of different forms. Now, traditionally in Canada, it's been part of the consultation process, whereby Indigenous communities and members are invited to participate in archaeological projects. But increasingly, this is shifting towards Indigenous focus, Indigenous centered archaeological projects. We have a number of Indigenous identifying people who do, or I shouldn't say identifying people, that's not fair, who Indigenous archaeologists, period, who do archaeology. And this can be either in their home in traditional territories or in other regions as well. And so I've listed some of the key Indigenous archaeologists here in Canada. One of the activities I'd like us to do in Blackboard Collaborate this week is discuss a little bit about public perceptions of archaeologists and the role of popular culture in shaping the ideas of who does archaeology and the kinds of archaeologies that are being done. And for that, we'll look a little bit at the work of Renaud 2003. But it's hard to talk about archaeology without talking about pseudo-archaeology and the kind of negative side of often how archaeology is represented in popular culture. Now, some representations of archaeologists and archaeological insights in popular culture in shows like Ancient Aliens are almost laughable, right? They seem like they can be brushed off, but we have to take them seriously. And I discuss some of the consequences of pseudo-archaeological interpretations in terms of reinforcing colonial and racist narratives below. Archaeology has a long link, in particular pseudo-archaeology has a long link with nationalism, that while it can have beneficial outcomes for many communities, in some cases it can have negative consequences as well. And the use of pseudo-archaeology or archaeological evidence for political purposes and kind of misrepresentations or false representations and interpretations of archaeological material has been best documented or has been well documented, in Nazi Germany. And so I talk about in this slide and following slides about how the Nazi Party invested heavily in archaeology. So one of the questions we'll talk about in Collaborate this week is what the harm is of pseudo-archaeology, aside from just reinforcing problematic nationalist, racist, and colonial narratives. And I'll talk a little bit about how shows that maybe aren't as easy to brush off as Ancient Aliens for their kind of problematic outcomes. We'll talk about the show Battlefield Recovery, or what it was formerly known as Nazi War Diggers, and how unethical practices are often represented as quote-unquote real archaeology on television, when indeed they are unethical, inappropriate, and not archaeological, but represent pseudo or false archaeology. So I'll see you in Collaborate this week, where we can talk about this at a little more length.